What if the greatest leader never sat on a throne? What if the most powerful Prime never claimed the title? In a world of warriors and tyrants, where strength is measured by firepower and legacy is carved through war, one Prime chose stillness. He watched from the shadows, while others built monuments to themselves, because Alpha Trion understood something the others didn't, that the most important battles aren't won with weapons, they're won with wisdom, with memory, with the courage to raise others higher than yourself. Before the Matrix found Optimus Prime, it passed through his hands. Before Cybertron remembered the names of its heroes, he remembered the names they forgot. He could have ruled. He could have rewritten history. Instead, he archived it. This isn't the story of a warlord. This is the story of the Prime who chose to be forgotten, a builder of leaders, a keeper of truth. This is Disassembled, Heroes and Villains. And today, we follow Alpha Trion to understand how his legacy was written not in battle, but in the ones he chose to lift above himself. How do you measure the worth of someone who never asked to be remembered? To understand Alpha Trion, you don't follow his footprints, you read the records he left behind. Because he wasn't a conqueror, he was a chronicler. While others fought to shape the future, he fought to preserve the past. He knew that one day, the battles would end, and all that would remain are the truths we chose to carry forward. So before we talk of destiny, we need to talk about memory, because sometimes, the one who writes history shapes it more than those who live it. Before the war, before the rise of Megatron, there were those who built Cybertron's future through power, and those who shaped it through memory. Alpha Trion was the latter. Across both Generation 1 and the aligned continuity, Alpha Trion is many things: scribe, scholar, sage, but more than anything else, he is the guardian of Cybertron's past. In a civilization of living machines driven by progress, conquest, and transformation, he remains something rarer, a witness. In the original G1 cartoon, Alpha Trion is introduced not as a warrior or a Prime, but as an old bearded mech dwelling on Cybertron, long thought lost to time. He lives in hiding, preserving knowledge, guiding quietly from the shadows. When Alita 1 is wounded, it's Alpha Trion who gives part of his own energy to restore her spark, a quiet act of compassion from a mech who never sought the battlefield, but always understood sacrifice. And while hints in G1 suggest a deeper connection to Optimus Prime, it's the aligned continuity where his role truly expands. There, Alpha Trion is not just a wise old bot, he's one of the 13 original Primes, a being created at the dawn of Cybertron itself, a Prime not built for battle, but for memory. In the Covenant of Primus, he serves as the scribe of the 13, chronicling the rise of Unicron, the birth of Primus, and the first age of Cybertron. He watches civilizations rise and fall. He sees empires consumed by their own hubris, and through it all, he writes. But these aren't just stories. They're warnings, because Alpha Trion doesn't collect history for nostalgia, he preserves it so it's never repeated. When the 13 disband, he retreats from the world stage. He watches silently as Cybertron forgets its origins, as the High Council manipulates truth to consolidate power, and when Megatron emerges, he sees the echoes of older tyrannies, systems that once brought ruin, now reborn in different armor. It's the age of rising chaos that Alpha Trion does something extraordinary. He doesn't rise to stop Megatron himself. He doesn't declare himself a Prime again. Instead, he prepares the next one. He begins to shape a replacement, not through domination or ideology, but through patience, mentorship, and remembrance. And when the moment finally comes, when Sentinel falls and Cybertron teeters on the edge of annihilation, Alpha Trion places the matrix of leadership into the hands of Orion Pax. Not because Orion was the strongest, not because he was the loudest, but because he was the most curious, because knowledge, true knowledge, is born from humility. It's a moment that defines Alpha Trion's entire legacy. He has the power to rule, but chose instead to pass it on. While Megatron built a movement out of anger, and Optimus built hope through inspiration, Alpha Trion built something even rarer, a bridge between past and future. Not a forger of memory, but a keeper of it. Not a conqueror, but a custodian. He doesn't fight for Cybertron's history to be glorified. He fights for it to be remembered accurately, because he knows the most dangerous thing you can lose isn't your past, it's your understanding of it. He sees how easily facts become myths, how truth becomes weaponized, and how civilizations fall not because they forget who they are, but because they forget what they've already done. In a world obsessed with progress, Alpha Trion reminds us to pause, to look back, to ask the questions no one else is willing to ask. What did it cost to get here? Who paid that price? And what will happen if we forget them? Because to Alpha Trion, wisdom is power, but only if you choose to carry it forward. But what good is wisdom if it never leaves the archive? For Alpha Trion, history wasn't just something to be studied. It was something to be used, to guide the present and shape the future. And the greatest test of that wisdom came not in battle, but in choice. Because one day, a humble data clerk would enter his orbit, and Alpha Trion saw something no one else did. Not what Orion Pax was, but what he could become. And with that, a Prime is born. But the greatest leaders are chosen by someone who saw who they could become long before the world did. In the Generation 1 continuity, that someone was Alpha Trion. We first meet him in The Search for Alpha Trion, an episode that unveils his past ties to both Elita 1 and Optimus Prime, but it's in War Dawn where we witness the most defining act, the transformation of Orion Pax into a Prime. He's not a soldier or a general. He's a solitary figure, dwelling in the ruins of Cybertron long past its golden age, watching as the war tears its people apart. When a young dock worker named Orion Pax is mortally wounded by Megatron's betrayal, it is Alpha Trion who finds him. He doesn't hesitate. He doesn't ask for thanks. He rebuilds him, not just with stronger armor, but with purpose. Orion doesn't just become a Prime, he becomes Optimus Prime, a symbol of justice, compassion, and resistance in the face of tyranny. Alpha Trion never steps forward to take credit. In fact, he fades into the background again, letting the myth of Optimus grow while he keeps his watch from the shadows. Later episodes imply he continues to help behind the scenes, safeguarding the matrix of leadership and intervening only when absolutely necessary. And though the show never confirms a literal bond between them, the connection feels deeper than fate. Not quite father and son, but something close. Because Alpha Trion didn't just save a life, he chose to bestow a legacy. In the aligned continuity, this act takes on even a greater weight. According to the Covenant of Primus, the in-universe sacred text that defines the origin myths of the aligned continuity, Alpha Trion was one of the original 13 Primes, forged by Primus himself. While the other Primes took to the stars or vanished in legend, Alpha Trion remained. He took no throne, waged no campaigns. Instead, he took up the role of lore master, recording Cybertron's history, studying the patterns of rise and fall, and waiting for the day when the Matrix would need a new bearer. That day came when a young archivist named Orion Pax, a humble data clerk, not a warrior, began to question the High Council and expose Megatron's rise. Alpha Trion saw something in Orion, not just of defiance or bravery, but heart. It was Alpha Trion who guided it to Orion. He stood at the threshold, handed over the artifact, and said goodbye. He could have claimed it himself. He could have rewritten the story, taken power, ruled Cybertron as its rightful Prime, but he didn't. He chose not to lead, so someone better could. In Transformers Prime, the decision echoes quietly but profoundly. Alpha Trion only briefly appears on screen, but his appearance is deeply felt. He communicates with Optimus through the Matrix, offering guidance during moments of crisis. When Optimus loses his memory and becomes Orion Pax once more, it is Alpha Trion's knowledge, recorded and relayed through Ratchet, that helps bring him back. He was always there, not in command, but in conviction. And maybe that's the core of who Alpha Trion is. He doesn't just build leaders for glory. He builds them because someone must. While Megatron forged ideology and Optimus inspired loyalty, Alpha Trion built the foundations for both. He did not forge memory, he preserved it. He understood that history isn't just what's recorded, it's what's passed down. It's the wisdom that shapes characters before the battle begins. He watched the rise of the Primes, the fall of empires, and through it all, he chose to invest in people, not power. He saw the future in Optimus not because it was destined, but because he believed it could be better. That belief, that's where true leadership begins. Before we close the Covenant and return Alpha Trion to myth, make sure to follow or subscribe to Disassembled Heroes and Villains on your favorite podcast app. Every week we explore the icons and monsters who shape pop culture, to understand not just their power, but their purpose. And this Friday, we unleash a different kind of leader, not one born of wisdom, but of fury. A king of strength alone, a warrior who would rather bite than bow. Next up, we tackle Grimlock of the Transformers. The next Tuesday, on Disassembled Deep Cuts, the storm breaks, and from the wreckage rises a Decepticon born of divine madness, a herald of the Matrix, corrupted. Next up, we descend into the mind of Thunderwing, and if you want to help decide who we dissect next, cast your vote every Wednesday in the Handsome Comics YouTube community poll. Now, back to the Prime who chose not to lead. But Alpha Trion's story doesn't end with the forging of Optimus, because what truly makes him rare, what sets him apart from every warlord, counselor, and Prime who ever carried the Matrix, is what he chose not to become. He was one of the 13, a Prime by right, but he never wore the crown, never commanded an army, never claimed the glory he could have easily seized. Instead, he stepped back, not out of weakness, but because he believed legacy wasn't forged through domination. It was handed forward to those who still had time to shape the world, because sometimes the greatest leaders are the ones who walk behind. He was one of the 13, a Prime by right, but he saw something more important than legacy. He saw the future. Across the multiverse of Transformers lore, Alpha Trion is a character defined not by what he takes, but by what he gives up. Power, recognition, command. Those were his by birthright, or in some continuities, by deed. But in every incarnation, he chooses a different path. Not to rule, but to guide. In the aligned continuity, as detailed in the Covenant of Primus, Alpha Trion stands among the original 13 Primes, those forged by Primus himself at the dawn of Cybertronian history. He wields the Quill, a sacred artifact of knowledge and record-keeping, while others of his kind, like Megatronus or Prima, embody war, justice, or wrath. Alpha Trion embodies memory, lore, and legacy. He could have claimed the Matrix, shaped the future with his own hands, but instead, he recorded it. And when the time comes, he passes that responsibility to another, to Orion Pax, to Optimus Prime. He watches a new leader rise not by fate, but by merit, and he lets go. And in Transformers Animated, Alpha Trion holds no weapons, he commands no armies, yet his voice carries more weight than any general's blade. As the head of the Guild's Domesticus, a civilian branch of the High Council, he represents the true soul of Tron, its people, not its soldiers, and in that role, he clashes again and again with Sentinel Prime. Sentinel seeks glory, Alpha Trion seeks balance. When Megatron hijacks Omega Supreme, it's Alpha Trion who urges caution. When Sentinel Prime violates protocol, Alpha Trion holds him accountable. And when the day is saved, not by armies, but by a medic and a child, it's Alpha Trion who names them heroes. He could seize control, strip Sentinel of power, but he doesn't. He simply reminds the Council, in Cybertron, that leadership isn't about might, it's about responsibility. Across all these realities, the pattern is the same. Alpha Trion could have led, he could have ruled, but he didn't. He chose to shape the world from the wings, not the throne, because legacy isn't built by holding on, it's built by knowing when to let go, and in letting go of power, he made room for something greater to rise. He didn't lead with the Matrix, he led with the Quill. He didn't carve his name into Cybertron's walls, he wrote down everyone else's, because across every timeline, Alpha Trion isn't just a mentor, he's a memory. While others rose and fell, grabbing power, rewriting laws, or simply fading into obscurity, he remained, a quiet constant, watching, recording, remembering. But what happens when you're the only one who still remembers? In Cybertron's darkest moments, when history becomes myth, then myth becomes forgotten, it's Alpha Trion who holds the truth, the path, the pain, the ancient wisdom no one else dares carry, because Alpha Trion doesn't fight to be remembered, he fights to remember, and with that burden of memory comes the cost of knowing too much, especially when no one else will listen. Across time and space, Alpha Trion carries not just Cybertron's legacy, but its scars. When others forget the old ways, the old wounds, the ancient truths buried in rust and silence, he remembers, because someone must. In Cyberverse, he's more than just a relic of the past, he's the last guardian of it. At the dawn of the war, when the Ark is besieged and hope teeters on extinction, it is Alpha Trion who gives his life to save the future. Megatron kills him, coldly, methodically, snuffing out not just a spark, but a history, a lineage, a memory. And yet, even in death, Alpha Trion is not gone. Within the Allspark itself, his presence endures. He returns to Optimus in visions, fragments, whispers through time, not as a ghost, but as a memory made manifest. He speaks of what once was, and what could be again. In that realm beyond life, it becomes the living proof that knowledge cannot be destroyed. It only waits for those worthy to find it. But memory, as Alpha Trion knows all too well, is a double-edged sword. In the aligned continuity, as one of the original 13, he bears the Quill, Primus's instrument of record. He doesn't fight with it, he writes with it. And in those writings, the Covenant of Primus, he does not record only triumphs, he records horrors, betrayals, the slow unraveling of a utopia poisoned by pride and power. He remembers Solus Prime's death, he remembers Megatronus' fall, he remembers the age when brother turned against brother, and when the Matrix was passed from hand to hand like a dying torch. These are memories no one wants to hear, and yet, he preserves them, not to shame the past, but to warn the future, because Alpha Trion understands what so many do not. Forgetting the past does not bring about peace, it is only a prelude to war. In the initial IDW continuity, this burden isolates him. He walks through ages like a shadow, older than nations, older than war, and still, he remembers what others have chosen to forget. He sees Nova Prime rise with glorious promises, and quietly corrupts the Senate from within. He witnesses Orion Pax wrestle with morality in a world that has lost all sense of it. And through it all, Alpha Trion tries to speak, to warn, to guide. But who listens to the historian when the Conqueror has the microphone? As Cybertron devours itself in tyranny and blood, Alpha Trion steps away, not out of cowardice, but out of futility. He becomes a relic in real time, a monument no one visits, a memory outliving its usefulness. And yet, he endures. Because memory, for Alpha Trion, is not optional. It is duty, even when the world moves on. Because memory, to Alpha Trion, is a weapon, a responsibility, and a curse. What do you do when you're the only one who remembers a mistake? What do you do when you know the war isn't new, but a repetition of the old one forgotten? You write it down. You whisper it to the next leader. You become the past, so that someone else can shape the future. But that burden is not without cost. In every continuity, Alpha Trion is marked by quiet sorrow, not the dramatic grief of battle, but the weariness of bearing too many names, too many secrets, too many final goodbyes. He has outlived friends, outlived empires, and still he carries their stories. Because someone must. Because history that is not remembered is history doomed to be repeated. And so, whether in the crypts of Iacon, the pages of prophecy, the shadows of the Allspark, or the ruins of Crystal City, Alpha Trion endures. Not to lead, not to conquer, but to remember. And in that memory, he becomes something rarer than a prime. He becomes a witness to their greatness. He doesn't command battalions. He doesn't shout orders across the battlefield. He doesn't even raise his voice. Because Alpha Trion doesn't lead with power. He leads with presence. And that presence only surfaces when the future is truly in danger. When the cycles of war threatens to erase everything that came before it. That's when he steps forward, not to fight, but to guide. Not to conquer, but to remind. It's easy to mistake his absence for weakness, to assume that silence means surrender, but Alpha Trion understands something most leaders never learn. Sometimes, the greatest strength is knowing when not to act, because not every crisis demands a sword. Sometimes, it demands a witness, a guardian of the past who trusts the next generation to rise. And when this role is done, he doesn't demand statues, he doesn't cling to legacy, he simply fades away as the quiet watch comes to an end. In many continuities, Alpha Trion's death is not a spectacle of glory or defiance. It's not a battle cry, it's a passing breath, a final gesture of trust in those he mentored. In the aligned continuity, we never see his final moments. His presence echoes throughout Transformers Prime, and by the time of Robots in Disguise, his absence is simply accepted. Optimus refers to him in the past tense. His spirit appears in visions, guiding from the Well of All Sparks. But there's no monument, no grave, only the knowledge that his final lesson was to disappear and let others lead. In Cyberverse, his role is even more symbolic. When the multiversal crisis, known as the Quintesson invasion, tears through reality, it's Alpha Trion who speaks from the shadows of memory, passing his wisdom to a younger Optimus. His voice echoes in flashbacks, and ancient records, in final transmissions, not a warrior, but a whisper, a reminder that the past matters, even when no one listens. Even in shattered glass, a twisted mirror where morality is inverted, Alpha Trion is still the quiet force in the shadows. Manipulative, yes, but not loud. He is a historian, rewriting truths to shape tyrants, and in the end, even his silence there has weight, because the Alpha Trion archetype, no matter the universe, is not a general or a god. He is a librarian, a watcher, a mentor. And his endings reflect that, rarely seen, rarely mourned, but always felt. His true legacy is not etched in the monuments, it's written in the sparks of those who outlived him, in Optimus Prime, in Elita 1, and the Autobots who carry his lessons forward, whether they know it or not, because some warriors change the world by burning it down, others change it by building a better one and stepping aside. Alpha Trion chose the latter. He knew that leadership isn't about how loudly you speak, it's about when you choose to stay silent and who you trust to speak after you're gone. He didn't need to raise his voice, because the echoes of his wisdom are still being heard long after he left the stage. He never raised a weapon, he never wore a crown, and yet Alpha Trion shaped the fate of Cybertron more than most who did, not through conquest, but through conviction. Through every war, every prime, every fall of Cybertronian society, he carried one mission, to protect what mattered most, even when no one else remembered why it mattered. And now, with the story winding down, one question remains. What do we take from the life of a being who chose wisdom over war, who gave up his seat at the table so others could sit? Because Alpha Trion's story isn't just about Cybertron, it's about us, and what kind of legacy we leave behind. He could have been king. He could have seized power, taken up arms, declared himself a prime in name as well as spirit. Few would have questioned him, but Alpha Trion didn't choose the spotlight. He chose the shadows. Not out of cowardice, but out of clarity. And in that decision lies a lesson that echoes far beyond Cybertron. In today's world, especially as men, as fathers, as leaders, it's easy to confuse volume with virtue. We're told to be loud, to be first, to be dominant. But Alpha Trion shows us another path, a higher path. He teaches us that wisdom isn't about knowing everything. It's about knowing when to speak and when to stay silent, when to act and when to step aside. That restraint isn't weakness, it's strength, held in trust, discernment, and self-mastery. And perhaps, most of all, he reminds us that legacy isn't built through control, it's built through release. He let go of power so others could rise. He mentored instead of manipulated. He recorded truth instead of rewriting it. There's a deeply spiritual echo in that. In many Christian teachings, Christ himself, the divine, chose humility, service, and sacrificial love over the throne of earthly power. The greatest among us, we're told, are the servants of all. Alpha Trion may be fiction, but the values he embodies, patience, wisdom, long-suffering, quiet strength, these are internal truths, especially for those of us trying to raise children, love our families well, and leave behind something worth more than gold. You don't have to be loud to lead. You don't have to rule to be righteous. You don't have to win to be worthy. Sometimes the greatest leaders are the ones no one sees until everything falls apart. So if you're listening to this and wondering whether your quiet efforts matter, it does. Because just like Alpha Trion, you may not be the one to wear the crown, but you just might be the one who prepares the one who does. Thank you for walking with us through the silent strength of Alpha Trion, through the records he kept, through the leaders he's raised, through the wars he's watched unfold, yet refused to let define him. We've seen a Prime by right choose the shadows over the throne, an ancient warrior become a keeper of memory, a builder of leaders who never needed the title for himself. And in that stillness, he teaches us something deeper, that wisdom isn't just knowledge, it's patience, restraint, discernment. That leadership isn't proven by the crown you wear, but by the lives you elevate, by the people you prepare to carry the fight when you're gone. Alpha Trion doesn't rewrite history to make himself a hero. He preserves it. He bears the burden. He remembers, so the next generation can rise higher than the last. Because the loudest legacy is often the quietest. Because the greatest leaders don't raise swords, they raise others. So ask yourself, who are you mentoring? What truth are you preserving? What are you building that others will inherit when you're gone? Are you trying to be remembered? Or trying to build something else worth remembering? So stay wise, stay steady, and as always, stay handsome. And remember, real legacy is not about being seen. It's about what remains when you're gone.